Disillusionment, disenchantment, apathy, and cynicism. These are all little signposts that something is not right. If we consider that the church is supposed to be manufacturing saints, it inverts the why of what we're doing. And so I think a lot of times we don't have that mindset of what church actually is. We have this idea of like a growth mindset or like a cultural impact mindset or whatever. So the church should be the place where saints are manufactured. The New Testament idea of like the New Covenant community is the place where the divine life is made manifest. And so if in your church the divine life is not made manifest, you have massive questions.
Josh Nadeau, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, so excited. Thank you so much for having me, my friend.
I've been really looking forward to this. I've known you through the internet for a while, and people who, even if they don't know your face, I bet they have come across your art on Instagram if they run in Christian circles. But you've recently written a really just excellent book, Room for Good Things to Run Wild. We're going to be talking about that today. But for people who don't know you, what's like the brief way of saying, hey, here's who I am?
Well, from Canada, from the West Coast, so the Great White North, your potential, what, like 51st state? Is that the latest thing?
No
I'm
comment.
an artist. Yeah, no comment. I'm an artist, so I've been doing a bunch of art for a long time. You can see it at Sword and Pencil. And then I'm a writer, and so I have a Substack called Everyday Saints, and now a book. That's
Yeah,
me in a
and
nutshell.
that's wonderful. I was telling you before we got started here that there's so many nice things I could say about this book. And I think the thing that really jumps out to me is that I'm always reading books and talking to Eliza, my wife, about them. And she's like, wow, like you're a nerd. No thanks. Don't want to read that one. And I was describing this book to her and she's like, when are you going to be done so I can read it? And I was like, sweet. Yeah, absolutely. But you've done a really unique thing with it. I don't know exactly how to describe it. It is a book that largely shares kind of your story of struggling with alcohol, then kind of searching for meaning, trying to find a deeper way of spiritual formation or maturing in your faith. But you don't write it in the kind of standard way of like, hey, I had this problem and then I found a solution and now everything's really great. Here's the 5-step plan for doing that. Like, not to bash those books, but it's a really interesting blend of narrative and insights along the way. Talk to me a little bit about just like what you were aiming for in this book.
Yeah. So I had this idea. So Hemingway, who's right here behind me, Ernest Hemingway is one of my favorite authors. He wrote a book called The Movable Feast, which is like a narrative nonfiction of his time in Paris, becoming a young man. And he talks about how if you're fortunate enough to be a young man in Paris, you take it with you forever because Paris is a movable feast. And when I moved to the big city, when I moved to do my master's in seminary in downtown Toronto, I had my own process of becoming a man, and the book kind of walks through a bunch of that stuff. And so I wanted to take the idea of a movable feast, a narrative nonfiction, and use that as a framework for communicating spiritual formation. The main reason is I don't think we're just brains. And so this idea of like spiritual formation by intellect or facts, or even just things that appeal to the intellect, right? I also wrote a book. And so, like, I'm not saying books are bad. I wrote a book. Um, so the idea was to take all of the things I had come to know in my mind and in my body about spiritual formation and translate them into a narrative that would invite people into their own narrative.
I love it. I think, I mean, the way you do it, it makes it for such a fun read. Usually at this point, when I have people on the show, I don't actually talk about their books all that much. We just talk about the ideas. But I just genuinely enjoyed the book so much that wanted to kind of hear what you were thinking about in it because it's different. And I can't wait for more people to read it. Obviously, the link will be in the description here. Josh isn't paying me to say any of these nice things. It's just genuinely that much fun. And when you come across a good book, you like to recommend it to people, and so I can't recommend it
Yeah.
enough.
Even if I was paying you, the conversion from Canadian to USD, it would not be enough to get this many kind words.
Yeah, it's just not worth it at that point. No, but I want to talk about some of the things that you ran into in this book and that you share. And I think the place I want to start is, where do you think a lot of spiritual formation goes wrong? I mean, you already hinted at we're not just brains, but
Hmm.
I think we have kind of similar stories insofar as like growing up in the church and you're given certain answers. And then at some point, those answers just don't seem to work as well as maybe you thought. What do you think's going on with that?
I think lots of the reasons why formation isn't working for us is because we live in a, I think we're, as evangelicals, like if you look at the modern evangelical world, that's like the domain that this was published in. People are functionally Gnostic. And so I think no one is legitimately a Gnostic. No one's like, hey, yeah, this is a heresy I subscribe to. But we do have the, and I know Gnosticism is like a very complex idea from the scholarly perspective, but at the base level of material bad, spiritual good, I think that's how we treat ourselves as people. It's how we treat our teaching from the church. And it's also how we treat solutions, right? So if I just think the right things, if I do these quote unquote spiritual practices, everything's just going to be okay. And I think what ends up happening, I think most people are like me. The way I wrote the book was I think there's a silent majority of people who are sitting in our churches languishing because all the promises they had in their faith aren't translating into the like the fruitful life that they're supposed to have. And so when push comes to shove in life, you have a few options. One of them is you become a hypocrite and you just pretend, you fake it till you make it. You're like brainwashed essentially at that point. You're just like, I'll do and say whatever I can so someone will love me and people will accept me. And maybe I'll just say the magic phrases enough times and Jesus will come through. Or you do what happens to me, which you just get pushed to the like the utter limit of your faith in life. And my faith was so central to my life that for me it was like the book opens with me as an alcoholic feeling suicidal. And so it was like, listen, I got to figure this out or it's game over.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people have that feeling of, whether they're at rock bottom or they just feel like they're falling through it, that this isn't working. And the frustrating thing is that we're sold a vision of the Christian life that sounds compelling a lot of the time, right? Like,
Mhm.
and we have this idea of what it's going to look like to be a Christian. And the reality is just like, we feel like everyone else, except for we use half of our weekend going to church and we're wondering why we're doing that because we're not getting much out of it anyway, right? Um, and there's got to be something more. Like, I think that's the refrain we hear from a lot of people, even if they believe all the right things. It's like, it's just like, this isn't working. This is supposed to be better, isn't it? One of the insights it seems like you came across along the way, which I really appreciated, is you began to compare your experience of going to a boxing gym with what it looks like to grow in the faith. What did that teach you? Taking up boxing, from the beginning and learning from that.
Yeah. So the idea of what's the best way of saying this? So like you're saying, people were looking for something more and the church was giving like secrets to save us, right? So come to the next sermon series because there's going to be some secret message you've never heard before and this will be the thing that saves you. So when I got back into boxing, it was one of those moments where you could read about boxing, you could study boxing, you could watch YouTube videos about boxing, you could follow a bunch of professional boxers on Instagram or Twitter or whatever or X, whatever people do. And it's not going to make you a better boxer, right? It's not going to build your cardio, it's not going to build your strength, and sure as shooting, it's not going to stop someone from like snapping out a quick jab and splitting your lip. And so when I went to boxing, it was this real embodied moment of like you use your body and you work yourself ragged and you're there with a bunch of other guys and girls. And there's a camaraderie in how hard you're working together. And then there's a camaraderie in pushing each other to the limit to get better. And every time, so when we'd spar, when I first went, I'd spar and I had some friends who'd been there for years and they'd be like, hey, Josh, I'm going to go at like 25% speed, but I'll use all of my skill. So they start moving and it's bobbing and weaving and hooks, body and head, and just overwhelms you. And then it's like a split lip, it's a headache, I'm tagged here. And the coaches are right there and they're like, hey, do you want to know why you keep getting tagged? Do you want to know why this is happening? And they keep walking you through immediately all of these expressions of your weakness. And so I remember I have the passage in the book. I'm cycling home and it's all uphill. So I can feel my weakness in my body, right? Like I'm not strong enough to be a good boxer. My legs are tired. My heart is still pounding. And I'm cycling through the city being like, hey, this is how we should do discipleship. It should not just be in the mind. It should be together. It should be community. It should be embodied. It should be immediate. There should be this kind of like saints are forged in the fire. And if we want to be able to go out into the world and live a life, so if you want to be able to be a boxer and go win a fight, whether in a competition or protect people in your day to day life, the reason you go to the gym is get stronger, and that means you have to get rid of the weakness. And so the way that boxing reframed was one of the beginning steps of reframing my conception of what formation and discipleship and even embodiment looked like was literally you think you know something about boxing and then you get punched in the face and then you and fighting and then you just don't know anything about it.
Yeah. And so I'd be curious as we tie this into the spiritual life, do you think where are we missing it? Because if I'm looking at kind of the blanket advice that it seems we give people is it is, come to the next sermon series, go to that retreat, whatever, come to the conference, these big hype moments. But then there is also, in fairness, like the hey, pray and read your Bible, pray and read your Bible. And that seems to be kind of like the extent of the advice I got most of my upbringing is like, that's what you do. I don't know. That's how you grow. And it's not that those things are wrong. Pray and read your
Yeah.
Bible. Like, I don't think you're going to come up with a spiritual plan that doesn't include those things. But why isn't it working for people? Is it that, because there's different ways we can take this. It's like, I guess I'm just not training hard enough. So I need to read more and pray longer. Or are we missing some conceptual thing here? Like we're not approaching it in the right way or something different. But if you're looking at that kind of basic life script that we're giving out, what's missing and what would make it more like the boxing gym?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because even the way that you framed the examples you gave are the things that I was exposed to growing up, right? So like, hey, if I something's not working in my life, I need to be doing more praying and more Bible reading, and then maybe things will work. Or maybe I'm not conceptualizing, maybe I'm not thinking about this properly. And the craziest thing about this is so simple, and it's the simplest message in my book, which is just like, listen, you take the next real step with your life. And so for me, the solution was listen, I know what the truth is. I need to embody that truth. I need to incarnate that truth. So the virtues were a massive eye-opening experience for me. Wherein I was born and raised Protestant. I went to a Reformed Baptist seminary, and I'm not any of that now. But the I have this little section in the book about John Owen's mortification of sin, where all of my Christian life was framed up in get rid of sin, and just that was it. And then if you start talking about, hey, like, hey, what does it mean to be kind or to show love? Every conception of that was still puts, oh, you want to show love? Put hatred to death. And I'm like, what the heck? You're saying the same thing, just a different way. And so I think what needs to happen for people is instead of like a reconceptualizing of spiritual practices, I think what you need to do, what I needed to do, was just start trying to live them as best as you can. And you pay attention to all of these little ways your body and soul are telling you things are right or wrong. So when you do something good for someone and you feel that inner joy, that's a good thing. Like you should delight to be doing good along with the good creator of the universe. And so the reason, so like there's all these layers to this. Like the reason we know the truth and we want to know the truth is because it helps us discern what's right and wrong. Because sometimes our bodies love bad things. We love overeating. We love doom scrolling. We love lust. We love all kinds of vices. And so we need to teach our bodies to not love those things, but our bodies are going to keep revealing tons of stuff. And then the further way you make it, like the boxing gym. So there's this subtle thing I do in the book where the first half is very isolated. I'm by myself, I'm drinking a lot, I'm smoking a lot, I'm alone a lot. And the second half continues to wed me with other people who are speaking into my life and helping me through these massive questions. And so part of the boxing gym was like, I was under tutelage. Someone was there to be like, hey, you keep dropping your hand, keep it up, right? Are you, whatever it is. And so when you think about virtue, be like, hey, you keep being greedy, be generous. And you're like, oh, I don't want to be generous. And be like, why? Pay attention. All that does is it is a reconcept, but it's like a new perspective. It allows prayer and Bible reading and any other spiritual rhythm to find its proper place in what formation is actually about, which is about deepening your love for Jesus with your body, with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, like the entirety of what Christ is after.
There's so many things I want to follow up on here, but I want to start with this idea of virtue versus just like killing vice. Because I agree that in my upbringing, it was often like, hey, just don't do this, stop doing this, stop doing that, kill this sin, et cetera, et cetera. But not so much, hey, move into these good and true and beautiful things. And I know the transcendentals are big in the book, but at a even higher level, you chose the title, Room for Good Things to Run Wild from Chesterton. And to me, that signals something very specific. Like you could have named this book, The Never Ending Fight Against Sin, the Flesh, and the Devil. And like that could be it, right? And
Yeah, totally.
that's an option. But you chose a more positive vision of what are we running after. What is that switch like in the Christian life when we go from, hey, here are all the things I'm not doing, to having a positive vision of the good, the true, and the beautiful?
Yeah. So part of my upbringing, I don't know if you felt like this, Austin, but part of my upbringing was like I was saved from hell, not saved to enjoy and participate in God. And that is an enormous shift. And then there's tons of other little things that go along with that. So Lewis says somewhere, I forget where, but almost the entirety of his early faith was coming up out of the little prison he made for himself and then stepping out into what I believe Chesterton calls the wild. And even Chesterton says, the more I considered Christianity, this is the quote that the book is titled from, that the established rule and order were not there to constrain me and like remove all the substance of who I was supposed to be. They were there to give room for good things to run wild. And so my vision was I lived in this first half of my Christian faith, which was, yeah, you do need to leave an old way behind. But the second half is this divine expansion where you think if you give Jesus everything, you're going to lose all your hopes, sayonara dreams, goodbye, good life. Now I'm stuck being like a nun or a monk or whatever. I don't get to drink. I don't get to eat. I don't get to do anything. And so for me, the reason why I was able to do it is like it's the devil you know is better than the devil you don't until it's not. And so the way I was living was actually killing me. And it was easier to live the lie until it wasn't. And so for me, when I got pushed to the brink, I just remember having this thought saying, listen, if it's going to be lights out, exit stage right, I might as well just give Jesus everything and see if it actually pays off. Because if it doesn't, then like, okay, I take the big sleep. And lo and behold, when like Jesus was right, like unless it's like each of you who try to keep your life will lose it. Those of you who lose your life for my sake in the kingdom, you will find it. And I look back. So when you ask, like, what does it feel like? Um, so good. And it's very hard. It's the hardest thing you'll ever have to do, right? The hardest thing I ever had to do was at every moment of this path, as best as I could. The reason why the book is narrative is like there's no and then moments. The and then moments are almost always followed by, oh, I messed up again. I need my hero to come and save me. I need Jesus. So one of the other literary influences in the book is F. Scott Fitzgerald, Great Gatsby. Great Gatsby is like an apostolic fiction book, and
I like that
he
term.
Right. Yeah, totally. Where he's like, listen, I'm the apostle of Nick Carraway's the apostle of Jay Gatsby. He's like, let me tell you about my best friend, Jay Gatsby. And at the end of the book, when you pull the covers away, spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book by now, then like, I don't know what to tell
Yeah,
you.
you're out of luck.
But Jay Gatsby's a fraud and a liar. And for me, when I got to pull the covers back, I was like, oh, Jesus, you were right all along. So that book for me is like, let me tell you about the guy who saved my life, Jesus. Um, and so, like, one of the craziest things about how hard it is along the way and all my failing was every step, even though it was hard, was good. And even when I failed and experienced grace and forgiveness and had to persevere, there was like a goodness and a wildness to the adventure of saying yes. Because when you say yes to Jesus, I'll stop ranting after this. When you say yes to Jesus, what's that Bilbo quote? Like, there's no knowing where you'll get swept off to. Legitimately, for us, we were around the world just so God could teach me these lessons. Because I was one of those guys who was like way too stupid to be able to learn it. I would just be like, be at my desk reading a book, be like, God, why can't I figure this out? And he's like, okay, Josh, let's figure it out.
I love that. And I want to talk a little bit about the travels and the role that plays in it. That was one of the pins I was sticking in my earlier follow up comments. But before we get there, I want to speak just a little bit to this idea of liturgies of death that you talk about in the book. And that those liturgies of death are things that contribute to getting to that place of rock bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a way, rock bottom was very redemptive for you, right? Like it was getting to that point that allowed you to say, you know what, I'm going to have to like give everything to Jesus and see if this works. Like I've got to at least give it a try. I imagine you would say though, like even though that worked for you, you wouldn't want everyone to get to that place. Like if you could course correct before then, it's probably preferable. And so, what is something that people can look to kind of identify in themselves of, hey, maybe I'm not at rock bottom right now. Like maybe everything looks like I have it together, and I'm just beginning to see some of these stirrings in me. But what are some of the kind of, I guess, the habits and routines that we're engaging in that are leading us to
Mm-hmm.
that place, but also some of the ways that we can identify, like, maybe things aren't going quite as good as it thinks. Like, maybe I've got the job, I've got the wife, the kids, and everything seems good, but I know something's not right and I don't know what it is. How could we maybe help people identify that before they hit the wall?
Yeah, it's a great question. Ideally, you're right. People don't hit rock bottom. That's like one of the reasons I wrote the book. Please don't make the same stupid mistakes I did. The things I recognize in me, and when I look at modernity and our current culture, disillusionment, disenchantment, apathy, and cynicism, these are all little signposts that something is not right. And like, listen, you should feel a tension of being a Christian in the modern world where like who I am and who I'm supposed to be and who God has created the world to be, that doesn't make sense with everything around me. We're going to feel that way to the end. But if your response to that is apathy and cynicism or disillusionment or discontentment or like disenfranchisement, like, oh, I hate the church, be like, well, you're not responding the way the saints have. You're not responding the way God in you desires you. And so these are signposts. So, number one, I would say pay attention to your body, pay attention to the stuff you love and the stuff you're hating. If you're hating what's good and loving what's bad, signposts. Practices, I mean, it varies for certain people. And I don't want to blanket um, condemn all kinds of practices, but it's like this very classic thing of like Jerry Bridges' Respectable Sins, right? He's got that book where like anything that is filling the void that you're using as a survival mechanism to get through the day, like it could be like me, alcohol. People are addicted to porn. People are addicted to their phones. People are addicted to Netflix. People are addicted to doing work in the church or reading books or anything, right? It could be literally anything that you're using as a coping mechanism. And so, like, the hardest part about um, the initial steps is that whole like examined life. And I don't think you have to be a super genius and contemplate every moment of every day, but you should be studying your life. Like at the end of the day, when you lay down to sleep, this is one of the things that we all know and experience. You close your eyes, and if you can't close your eyes in peace, if there's something that's got to get you there, whether just like you distract yourself to death looking at memes until you pass out, something's up. Whatever you're thinking about, all those hidden little things we tell ourselves, the ways we know we don't aren't adding up, the ways that we know life isn't going the way that we want. Like we have this idea in the church again that belief is enough. And belief is part of the whole of religion, but it's not the whole thing of religion. Embodiment is the whole, belief incarnated. And our body is telling us these things all the time. Like I said, I believe that we have this functional Gnosticism issue. So I cut my body off from my soul. I did all the spiritual stuff I was supposed to do, and my body was just being destroyed. And so I think every good decision we make leads us further up and further into the divine life. And I think every bad decision we make separates us. And so we're constantly on this upward ascension into life or downward into non-life. And so it's hard to say like the practices. Like I want to say if you wake up and the first thing you do is look at your phone, like, hey, that's probably a thing. Or if you're like me and the first thing you do is like take a double of bourbon in the morning, hey, that's probably a thing. So if step one is coping, is survival, then yeah, like I but don't one of the struggles in the book was as I was writing it, I really wanted to make sure that I didn't make those intro chapters feel romantic because there is
Mm.
like enough like I just have paid attention to these modern movements where culturally we love a broken hero, and it's really cool to be like, oh, a coyote carving through a dark city, you know what I mean? Oh wow, life is so hard, I could get dark and gritty. And so like that those are like cultural narratives that people love buying into, thanks to Netflix and TV shows that venerate and honor people who are like that. I wanted to do the opposite. I wanted to show how broken and empty and superficial and hypocritical it was, and then to show the lives of the saints to be the thing that were thick and rich and powerful and potent. And so I really want to make sure that if people are, so all my heroes are writers. Hemingway's literally right there. Not all of them, most of them. And Hemingway killed himself, right? So like I want people to be able to recognize that like anything that doesn't lead you into life, you should be okay to cut out of your life.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that idea of our fascination with kind of the brokenness at the beginning, and I imagine that was a difficult thing to lean into. I wonder if part of that is in our constantly numbed and apathetic states that so many of us live in by just kind of like constant low level dopamine hits that keep us not really feeling anything, that even someone being kind of gritty and in the dumps, it's like at least that there's something real there, which
Yeah.
maybe is an inclination, like a good thing to recognize, oh, there's something real, but wrong to think that the just because it's real, it's good. Like there's bad
Yes.
real and there's good real. But I do wonder if there's something about us that like we're drawn to these characters who have some type of like rough edges because everything is just so rounded off and numbed today.
Oh my god. So Augustine says that it's easier to like redeem someone who has their passions and someone who's killed them completely. So like I think you're bang on. One of the reasons I wrote the book the way I did is I didn't want to aim it at the mind. I wanted to aim it at people's hearts. Because I think people's hearts need to be stirred again. People need passion. And what yeah, I think you're right. So in a passionless world, and by passion I mean like the philosophical sense of the passions, desires and impulses and cravings or whatever. Well, I guess that's not necessarily whatever, doesn't matter. So what I really wanted was this idea of like, hey, if you love something, even if it's not good, fine. We can orient that love to the right place. But if you're apathetic and cynical like I was, if you don't feel anything at all anymore, I wanted something in this book to show you the beautiful Christ, maybe for the first time, because maybe all you've ever experienced was platitudes and catchphrases and slogans and like, please sell yourself to the church for 99.99, right? Please give us your money, whatever. Maybe you just haven't seen how beautiful Jesus is. And maybe what you're doing, that whole Lewis thing, maybe you're just content to make mud pies on the shore, right? Oh, yeah, Netflix. Oh, yeah, this. Oh, yeah, that, whatever. And so I think what I wanted to do was say, listen, if you have any love, if you have any spark, and even if you don't, we could just set that ablaze. This is not a how-to book. This is a YB book. I wanted people to be like, why should I be a saint? Oh, because Jesus is literally the best thing ever. And the life of the saint is as hard as hell. Literally, I have to get the hell out of me to be a saint, but it's so beautiful. Like the life of a saint is it. There's not a single saint I know. I don't know many saints. There's not a single saint I've read about. Well, there's lots of everyday saints. That's why I wrote the book. Um, that their lives are not compelling and beautiful and stir that thing up in us. Like, so I was going to get a tattoo of a saint who, for some reason, right now, her name is slipping my mind because that's what happens on podcasts. But she was very young and she was asked to recant her faith and she didn't. So they threw her to the lion's den. And when the lions came to maul her, she shone bright, like the light of Christ shone through her, and the lions all bowed and licked her feet and she petted them, and then they beheaded her. And I remember reading her story for the first time thinking, Josh, is your life and love so bright that even your enemies bow at your feet? Not your feet, because like darkness cowers before light. And I was like, there's no way they would consume me. There's no goodness in me that they're afraid of. There's no virtue or beauty in me that they're afraid of, because I wasn't being a saint. I wasn't being who I should be. And so when I read the saints, I'm like, man, that is a compelling life. And if I have to get like, so many of us are martyred for our faith. I'd be like, why? Well, Jesus says, if they hated you, they'll hate me too. But it's okay. So the idea was, I think you're so right. We live in such a beige, gray, rounded, numb, distracted culture that anything with teeth feels alive. The problem is, I was saying this to someone the other day and under different circumstances. The problem is we can't tell the difference between like a wolf and a sheepdog. Wolves will eat you. Sheepdogs protect you. And so like what we need to do is pursue one and not the other. And so yeah, Austin, that's like very key.
Yeah. There's kind of a tension in the book that I want to get at here, and it comes back to this idea of traveling the world. Um, you're quick to point out that the kind of path that you took, which involved quitting your job at the bank, you start doing like delivery on your bike, and then soon enough you're moving to England, then you're in Spain. It's a whole journey, and you're quick to say like, look, this isn't going to be everyone's story. Like it's not going to be you're not all going to quit the job. You're not going to move to Europe for a little bit and sort things out. And I think that's a good thing to point out because like it's not in the cards for everyone per se. But at the same time, I do want to lean in before we get to all the reasons you might not need that. I want to lean in a bit to like why you did need that and why it maybe wasn't as crazy as it seems. Because if we all are living these liturgies of death and we are quite literally like walking ourselves into hell in the way that we're living, maybe drastic change is needed. Like I think
Come on.
there's this like veneer of respectable Christianity where it's like I've got a little Christianity on top of my white collar job and my white picket fence and all these things, and like it's just well put together. We've got our two kids, everything's great. We take them to soccer practice, and like we're just good citizens, and this is a little sprinkling on top. And like you did need to blow things up to put them back together. And
Yeah.
so before we talk about why not everyone's going to need to do that, and I think it's an important thing to talk about, make the case for me of like why sometimes you do need to do drastic things and pack your life into a backpack and move somewhere.
Yeah. I think you're bang on. Like Lewis says, God knocked down my house of cards to show me how weak it was. And it's a grace, like it's a grace that God does that. And so when I say, if you say yes, you have to be willing, I don't know where he will take people, but the adventure is wild, and it might be wild in its depth of locality. But like, you're right. If your life isn't working for you, you only have one go at this. This is your only opportunity. I think about the parables of Jesus all the time. So I have my master's, and I had to do a paper on the parables, and like a thesis seminar kind of thing. And I remember thinking to myself growing up, hey, I kind of get the parables. And then you read them and you have to respect Jesus as a teacher. And when you read the parables, you're like, man, this is insane. Like, this is so profound. And I constantly think about, to whom much is given, much will be required. Here are your 10 talents. Here's your 5. I never want to be the person who buries it out of fear. And when you talk about, here's my respectable little life with a little bit of Christianity sprinkled on top, that to me is a nightmare. Because when that person shows up on the other side before the master, I say like, hey, I didn't want to lose what you gave me. What does Jesus say? He's the strongest words for those people. And so I'm not telling, like, disclaimer, do not quit your job because Josh told you to. But I am saying be willing to give up anything and everything to pursue life. Because literally, I believe your soul hangs in the balance, right? Like, um, so yeah, like disruption is key. There have been people who messaged me already since this book has been out saying that they've quit their jobs, and I'm like, please don't do it because it said so in the book. But if the person was like, listen, I've been toying with quitting my job for the past 5 years, and like every week I feel like I'm going to type up the note, and I read your book, and he's like, I know what I should be doing, but my job pays me too much, and my life is too easy. And then he's like, I read your book, and he thought like, well, the easy life isn't the good life, so okay, like it's not necessarily good. So I would say to people, listen, when you pay attention to your life and you look at the things that are going on and you say, hey, is my life going as expected? The reason I use that word is I say it's a grace that life does not go as expected. It's one of the little liturgical statements. But when you think about your dream life, I'm not saying the white picket fence and your 2.3 kids or whatever replacement rate is, the whole thing. I'm saying, like, listen, is this the adventure that my faith was supposed to be? Like, am I making the kingdom known in my body and through my body to the world around me? And if I'm not, what's it going to take? Right? Like, is this like mediocrity? One of the things that is a huge thing in the book is just like this weird, intense mediocrity that so many of us live in. That beige 5.5 out of 10 experience of our faith, of our life, of our love. And if I said to you, hey, you could have that to the full, like Jesus says, and you'd be like, okay, what's it going to cost? And Jesus says, like, literally everything. And you'll have to face every manner of evil and hell to get there. And you'll get there, and then there'll be the next day where you have to face every manner of hell to get there again. And you do it. It is unbelievable. And like, my life hasn't been perfect since then. Things have been tough, and I've made tons of mistakes. But I know what death tastes like, and I never want to taste it again. So I'm just saying for people, yes, to make the case, um, cowardice is not a virtue. Mediocrity is not something to be praised. And um, benign apathy is not the way deeper into the life of Christ. Learning to say yes means you give up everything. And I don't know what that means for people, but you have to be willing to.
I love it. Now let's flip it on its head and let's talk about it from the other direction, because I think there's a danger in being too comfortable and in not being willing to say, like, yeah, I'm going to put my hand to the plow and not look back. But there's also this danger of, if we're not understanding these things correctly, one, we can kind of like over romanticize the idea of anything but the usual, in which case we see like a normal life, a 9 to 5 job, as an impediment to the path to sainthood rather than something that can be redeemed and a catalyst for that. I put out a video today actually with the title of something like, your 9 to 5 is a path to sainthood. So I
Yeah.
want to be careful to not miss that, because there's a couple things that can happen here as people listen to this. I know if like I don't know, 18-year-old Austin is listening to this, he's saying like, yeah, like we not settle for mediocrity, let's swing for the fences, but he has the exact wrong definition of greatness in mind. 18-year-old Austin like wants to be a mega church pastor and wants to be the best speaker of his generation and do all these things, and it's all wrapped up in his own ego. And so I think you also point out in the book some really important things, like the importance of local living, of not needing to be this like big person who's remembered. Like, I don't think you, I don't know if you quote him or not, but like preach the gospel, die and be forgotten, from the Moravians there. So, how do we also look at this and say, look, for some of you, it's not going to look like quitting your job, but it's going to look like going deep right where you're at, not
Bingo.
trying to be the next big Christian influencer and be remembered forever, but you're going to be faithful right where you're at. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I structurally the book does answer that question beginning to end, like a there and back again kind of story. But ideally, you have to like I have this quote in the beginning of like we have this modern world that thinks love we have love by novelty or wonder by novelty, when the deeper realities of love and wonder are intimacy. But we don't know how to do that. So when you talk about intimacy with God, we think novelty with God. I need to keep doing these new things. Intimacy is way better. Deeper is way better. And so for me to learn to go deeper, certain things, like I said, I attribute a lot of it to my stupidity and blindness and deafness, where I needed these enormous things to shake me up. And God was gracious to shake me up. Um, but the idea of like, my life now is not that. My life now is I go to the grocery store and I try to help people like old ladies pack up their car. No one knows. I mean, people now, but I'm not saying it. So whatever. I'm
You're good.
not,
You're good.
um, but like, there's like all these local things. I want to wake up and not be in a bad mood if my kid doesn't sleep well, right? Like, I want to learn what patience looks like when it actually matters, right? Not when it's easy, when it's really hard. I want to embed myself into my community. I want to be there for people, not just with my words, not just with my thoughts, but with my actions, with my whole life. And what I wanted to do in the book is paint this idea of the holy ordinary, how ordinary people become everyday saints. So we have this idea. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about in order to be someone, you have to become something. That's like the modern mantra. If you ask people what they want to be when they grow up, it's famous, and it doesn't matter in what domain. And I hate that. I despise that. I think to myself, so stupid and not worth chasing. Greatness is worth chasing. And here's what greatness is for the Christian: become a saint. And do you know how many saints are not canonized? You know how many saints have just lived and died? And no... So my dad's a pastor. He's a good man. I love local pastors. There's so many local pastors who work 60, 70, 80-hour weeks. They're in and out of hospitals. They're in and out of homes. They're meeting the old ladies who come into their office to talk about cats. They're leading the prayer meeting. They're folding the bulletins. They're vacuuming the church because the janitor got sick. They're doing everything. And I think to myself about the cultural movers and shakers of our generation. And I think about this local pastor, and I think about who's going to hear if I had well done, good and faithful. So Spurgeon tells this story. Spurgeon says he gets asked a question about the Wesleys, like, hey, do you think you're going to see the Wesleys in heaven? And Spurgeon's like, no. And everyone's scandalized because he thinks he's saying it because they're not Calvinistic. And he's like, those two will be so close to the throne of Jesus. I'll be lucky to catch a glimpse of them from up in the nosebleeds. And I believe that these local people who are living and moving and having their being in Christ and giving their whole life to God, and no one knows them, those people are going to be the people who are at the like right by the throne. I do not think this is no shade against famous people, but I do not think that our modern world of setting up celebrities is helping us. The church is not manufacturing saints, but we're manufacturing celebrities, is what I'm trying to say. Your holy ordinary life of where God has you in the situation and the context is his ideal to invade the finite with his infinite goodness and for you to be a catalyst to make that infinite goodness, truth, and beauty known. And if you say yes, then you're a little harbinger of the life to come. So I say this thing like saints leave little messes everywhere they are, right? Like flip tables, echoes of the life to come. And we could do that. Like I live in an apartment building and we, there are little volunteer things I do here that like my wife just found out about because she goes to sleep and I am part of like the little before we all go to bed. And I'm just plugged into my local little life because I care about the people I live with. And I'm not saying that now to be like, oh, wow, it's public on YouTube. There's tons of little things we do, but that gives me a lot of joy to help be there for the people in my life that have kids, that have work in the morning, that don't want their car broken into, don't want the stress of being towed or whatever it is. And so when I say like these holy, ordinary moments, there is nothing better than listening to your local pastor, connecting in your own small groups, building living relationships with the people in and around you, devoting yourself to truth and to goodness and to beauty, and just living a simple life.
I think one of the questions at the heart of so much of this is how do we learn to love the right things? And how do we learn to recognize the good as the good or greatness for what it really is? Because I'll say, growing up for me in church, greatness looked like having a big platform and being a charismatic speaker. And when, the people in my church saw me speak and they thought, oh, he's pretty good at that. Like that's what they cared about. And it's like, how can we get you to do more of that? And as long as you're not doing any kind of overt sins, like your formation, that we don't really care. Like, just don't get in the way of this good thing you've got going. And it's so
Did we go to the same
backwards,
church and not realize
right?
it?
Yeah, maybe we did. Um, and I think about people listening to this though, and I mean, the irony is not lost on me, right? Like we're both guys with platforms on the internet talking about Christianity. And there will be people who listen to this who see us as these like objects of desire in a kind of Rene Girardian way, right? And but perhaps in the wrong way. And it's like, oh, they've got platforms, like that must be what it's like to be a good Christian or something like that. And we're sitting here saying it's not. Um,
Yeah.
but people can spend all week with us in their ears. They have 2 hours with their pastor at church, maybe. How do we attune our loves, our sense of the good to the right thing when all week we're bombarded by whoever's got the biggest platform and the loudest voice, and we're constantly kind of giving our attention over to people and kind of forming our desires towards a vision of greatness that is bigger, badder, louder, like all of these things. So how do we learn to see the local pastor or the lady at church who's knitting the prayer shawl or whatever it is? Like, how do we see that as greatness?
Yeah. So one of the stories in the book that I tell was going to this conference. So I go to this conference, and one of my seminary professors invited me to like an after hours conference event. And so it was at this old museum. And I was dressed in like I was a skateboarder kid. And so I skateboarded over and I was in jeans and a t-shirt and a sweater. And everyone else was like decked out and to the nines. And it was about ended up being about marriage and the gospel and a bunch of stuff. But while people were mixing and mingling with finger foods, um, everyone was talking about church and the impact that they wanted to make and the legacy that they wanted to leave. And I kept asking people these questions like, what does that look like to you? What does that mean? And a lot of it was the classic stuff of like reproducing leaders and making some sort of cultural, global, whatever impact. Um, And so that event ended and I skateboarded back to the motel I was staying at with some people. And I asked some friends the same question and they just kind of parroted the same response. And so I think there was this deep seated idea that success and loving the right things looks like clout, popularity, whatever. And so you are right. Like it is kind of the pot calling the kettle black, where the two of us are on here with platforms telling people platforms are bad. And they're not necessarily bad, right? So for me, um, like just being very honest, like I don't like having a platform. There's a lot of things I need to deal with in my own life with other people because I have a platform. So life when I just shrugged off the responsibility of having a platform, and now that I've come to embrace it, the things that go through my mind, and any one of you who is an influencer who sees this, you should just think about these verses. Not many of you should teach unless you want to be judged more strictly. You should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. And our modern world is the complete opposite. And then Paul talks about, like, hey, what makes a good elder? They shouldn't be a recent convert lest they get puffed up. And so I just think about those things all the time because the scriptures are very wise with how they deal with this idea of what we would call platform or influence nowadays. But back then, they're thinking through authority. And so, like, it's okay. Like, that's the thing. So, Paul also says, like, hey, some elders are worth double honor. And it's okay to desire good things like authority, but you have to earn authority. And I'm not saying that you and I have necessarily earned it. One of the things that's tricky for me is all the ways I don't feel I've earned it. So it's a bunch of stuff I keep my mouth shut on. Like this book, I feel like an authority on it because I lived it for almost a decade, and then I studied it for almost not a decade, but I lived and studied it for a very long time in my life. So loving the right things is tricky, because oftentimes we end up in these echo chambers in churches that and this is no shade, I love the church. So much of the church does love the right stuff. But if you end up in a business church, if you end up in like corporate church, if you end up in self-help TED Talk church where the pastors are peddling merch and books, um, it's going to be hard to see what loving the right things looks like from an embodied real life perspective. So I would say like three or four things. Number one, the transcendentals do matter. So truth does matter. And finding the truth does matter. And it's pretty simple when it comes to what are the right things to love. We have a list of virtues as Christians. You have the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. And you have theological virtues, chastity, prudence, whatever the rest of them are. And those things are worth pursuing. Those, like, so you just think to yourself, like, what does humility look like? So say I have a platform. What does it look to be what does it look like to embody humility through a platform, or patience, or kindness, or generosity? Because the opposite tends to be the motivating factors. I want a platform because pride, ego, insecurity, whatever it is inside of us. Maybe people will love me if I'm famous enough. And so I would say learning to love the right thing is huge. Lewis talks about that. I've learned to love first things first so I can love second things best. And if we try to put second things in first position, we don't love anything well. And so Jesus is right when he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second commandment is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. On this, all the law and prophets hang. And so literally there's just nothing else. Love God, love your neighbor, and everything else will kind of fall into place. Now, I do understand you don't have to have it right. So I have a tattoo on the back of my arm. It's a chapter title in the book. It's a quote from Steinbeck. Now that you don't have to be perfect, you can be good. So you don't have to be perfect in your loves in order to start being good. You're going to learn. I have tons to learn still, but you do have to take the next right step. And so pretend you are an influencer hearing this. You're like, hey, I've been doing this out of pride and arrogance and need and greed and whatever. Maybe you have to pump the brakes and you're like, oh, well, my metrics are going to crash. Be like, well, maybe they're going to crash. Um, I take months off of Instagram every year and my metrics crash, but I have to do it for the state of my soul. I need to disconnect from and I'm already not online a lot, but I have to disconnect because I need my real life to be real and my virtual life to be virtual, right? I don't want that to overlap. So like now we've kind of met, but one day we'll meet and I'll be able to give you a hug and we'll be able to share a meal and I'll be able to, this is going to sound so creepy, but I'll be able to smell you and see you and touch you and be around you. And that's real life.
So that does bring me to kind of one of the last things that I wanted to cover today is the role of the church in all of this, because I think a temptation we have is to kind of write these stories and think about this as these lone wolves that go off and they experience some enlightenment. They pull themselves up from their bootstraps and they figure it out, right? Like, and there we have our hero. Maybe he meets a guide along the way, but it's the hero's journey fundamentally.
Mm-hmm.
And something you've brought up here, you've talked about local church pastors, you've talked about getting in the right context, all the way back to the boxing gym, like having the people around you, being under tutelage. And I think we'd be remiss not to talk a bit here towards the end about the role of the local church in all of this. As we pursue sainthood, something tells me it doesn't look like us just listening to the right podcasts, reading the right books, and trying a little bit harder all on our own. Where does the church play into all of this?
Mm-hmm. So in my story, part of the problem was the church was what made it difficult, right? The church, there were people who I believe were quote unquote everyday saints in spite of the churches they were in. And then when I went on my little journey, Chesterton talks about he was going to found a heresy of his own. And when he put the last dot over the I and the last cross of the T, what he discovered was orthodoxy, but just this deeper level of what it meant to be a Christian. And so when I went to the UK, we got plugged into a church, and that was another real embodied experience of a bunch of people pursuing Christ together. And that knocked scales from my eyes. And it was nothing like, it was nothing big, it was nothing crazy. It was just this idea of, hey, what if the church was concerned with producing saints? What if we were concerned with knowing the truth, embodying the virtues, participating in beauty, and making God known in us, in our own bodies, and through our bodies to the rest of the world? If we consider that the church is supposed to be manufacturing saints, it inverts the why of what we're doing. And so I think a lot of times we don't have that mindset of what church actually is. We have this idea of like a growth mindset or like a cultural impact mindset or whatever. So the church should be the place where saints are manufactured, right? The church should be the place where people meet with God, enjoy God, and bring God back out into the world. One of the things about formation that I see as a weakness in like the modern kind of fourth wave spiritual formation movement that's going on is its disconnection from the sacramental liturgical life of the church. Because all the spiritual practices should be rooted in something that is sacramental. That's like that's the ancient conception of what all the spiritual practices, that's where they're all founded in. And so like for evangelicals, if you're not necessarily sacramental to whatever extent, that doesn't mean that you don't need the rhythms, to use a popular word, of the life of the church in order to embody the virtues properly, right? So like we live in an individualistic time that's like you said, hey, if I'm just a lone wolf and go about my life in this way, I'm like the like all American Western hero that pulls himself up by his own bootstraps, that kills the bad guy on his own. But the New Testament conception of faith, the early church conception of faith, the majority of churches' conception of faith is done in community, and the local church is vital to that. And when you think about, if you think about local church as intellectual consumption of sermons and or 45 minutes of like emotional heartstring pulled, like your heartstrings pulled by worship, then of course you're going to feel some of the lack of your spiritual formation, because one of the things that's vital is the sacramental idea of enjoying and reflecting and contemplating and participating. I'm trying to use all the right language that anyone on the spectrum, if you're a memorialist or like full blown body blood, like Christ's death, life, death, resurrection is the center of what the of our spiritual formation, our life in the new covenant community, our life in the church should look like. So you say like, hey, what role does the church have? It's the one thing in the book that like I couldn't, if I had a thought, I told we were chatting about it. It was like, if I add this in, I have to add in like probably 100 pages. So what I did was tried my best to add subtle little nods of every time I'm feeling something and having something changed, it's coming through things that are happening because of the life of the church. People I'm meeting through Bible study, people I'm meeting through my time at the church, conversations we're having around resurrection. So it's a subtle like thing that I do in the book, but you are right. Like the life of the church is central to all of this. And if we remove the church from it, then I think it is just a quick hop, skip, and a jump towards slowly moving back to an intellectual, disembodied faith because you don't have a body to do the rest of it with, right? The church is also the body.
Absolutely. And I think for a lot of the people that watch my videos, they won't have any issues with the kind of more sacramental part. And they
Yeah.
might even add on, like, it's that sacramental part that makes the church more than just a Bible study or just relationships, like that there's something actually happening there that
Yeah.
we can't get over a Zoom call or that we can't get. Because if church is just a sermon and worship, like, I hate to break it to your local pastor, I'm sure he's great, but he's got stiff competition and there's someone that can preach better, and
Yeah.
there's, as great as your worship team is, like, there's better ones on Apple Music or Spotify or whatever you use, like, and all of a sudden it gets hard to make a case against just being that lone wolf.
Yeah.
And if it's just relationships, it's like, well, I can just go to small groups or whatever. But the fact that there is something happening there, and you don't have to be Catholic or Orthodox to think that something's happening there. But I do think if you can't answer that question of like, why should I really
Yeah.
go to church? Then it's, a decent time to do some soul searching around what is the church. I think everyone at the best of their tradition should have good answers to that, but we've sometimes just watered it down today. Josh, this has been
Yeah.
so much fun.
Yeah. So I
I
don't. You just got me
No,
all
go
amped
off
up,
on it.
and
Go
I
off
I
on it.
think it's super important because like the New Testament idea of like the New Covenant community is the place where the divine life is made manifest. And so if in your church the divine life is not made manifest, you have massive questions. And I think that there are different aspects of Christendom that seek to answer that. So like one of the reasons you have a Pentecostal movement and a charismatic movement is the divine life is made manifest in the spiritual gifts. And so like there are answers that are quote unquote bigger. And what I mean is like more broad than just the Eucharistic idea of a sacramental liturgy. But you do need an answer for that. And I don't care what gets people in the door and I don't care what gets people participating in the divine life. You just have to take the next right step. You need, like you said, you need a good answer for it. But um, these things are central to formation. I was just getting a ride. Me and my friend were driving in California. He was helping me out, taking me to a place I needed to go. And this is literally one of the conversations we had, that the modern weakness of our time is that spiritual formation in the neo evangelical movement is separated from um, like sacramentalism or the divine life. And it does become almost a caricature of people who push it. And it's not like there's a wide variety of people pushing it. So you can be like the quiet guy, the recluse who's like into the rhythms. You can be like the loud, boisterous, joy of the Lord guy who's into the rhythms. Um, but eventually, this is every movement that does not have its source and foundation in God, and by that I mean the sacramental idea of participating in the divine life, it's always going to end up becoming a caricature of itself, right? If you look at first, second, third wave evangelicalism, it's what has happened. And now we're moving on to another wave. And one of the reasons I think there's this enormous draw, and your audience, of course, knows this, to the East and to Rome, is because they don't exist in the same capacity there. There's always changes. Everyone who's done deep dives in any of this knows that things have changed in some capacity over the past 2,000 years, expressions wise. But there's a rootedness and there's a liturgical consistency over the course of time that's allowed people to bypass celebrity characterization of stuff and lean into. So I have friends who are Anglo-Catholic. We used to, this is when one of the times I was first starting my journey, and watching their entire life as someone who's born and raised Baptist become about the Eucharist, about prayer, about orienting their life around the life, death, resurrection of Jesus was deeply forming to me. And so I know your audience probably knows all this, but I just in case there's people who have not heard something of this before, please don't think that the church is expendable in this. And if you don't have an answer to why the church is not expendable, then you might be going on a different journey than you think.
See, now I want to know what you would have included in that extra 100
Yeah.
pages. But something tells me this won't be your last book, Josh. And like I said at the beginning, I really can't recommend it enough to people. I'm also so glad that I didn't cut you off there at the end, because I think that's a great place to leave people today. This has been an absolute blast. If people want to check out the book, they can use the link in the description down below. But Josh, thanks for what you're doing, and thanks for the gift of this book.